which is related to our work, our everyday work. It's CSS, and we have the chance to have Rachel, Andrew, talking us this way. Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, hello. Is that on mic? Excellent. So yeah, I'm Rachel Andrew. I'm a CSS person, not an XML person, and I'm here to talk a bit about CSS and kind of some of the changes that we've made with CSS recently. So I've been doing web stuff for a very long time. I kind of predate CSS, really. The first browsers I used didn't have any CSS. I kind of started doing web stuff with the version 2 browsers. I'm sure there are other people here who can sort of date back to that time. So I do various things. I'm essentially an independent. I've got a couple of products. I'm editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine. So I publish a lot of stuff and edit a lot of articles about the web technology. And I'm a CSS working group member. I actually represent a Dutch group of web developers, Frontiers. I'm sort of their representative in the W3C, and I'm also on the CSS working group. I edit multicol and the page float spec. I do tech writing and things for MDN. So I've been doing a lot of I've written loads of books about CSS, and I've been teaching CSS for a very long time. That really is the kind of main sort of thread of my career in all the different things that I've done. I've been teaching and talking to people about CSS. And I kind of figured that I'd figured out how to teach CSS. Because I've been doing it for such a long time. You know, I'd be like, well, this is a block thing, and this is an inline thing, and you can change the things between being block and inline. This is the box model, and it's really important and also very weird. And then we kind of do this stuff with widths, and we try and make a layout out of floats. But over the last few years, when I've been writing and speaking about CSS and about the new layout methods, things like flexbox and grid that have come into CSS, I've been sort of reordering my material. I've been changing the way that I teach CSS because it's become apparent to me that the way that we've been teaching layout is not going to give the new folk the kind of skills they need to master what we now have and what is coming in the future. And I also think that as people who, if people who teach CSS and those of us who write about it, maybe it's kind of been kind of a bit of a thing to talk about it as this sort of quirky, hacky language. We talk about, oh, here's a trick that lets you do this, and here's a CSS hack that lets you do this other thing. And I don't think that actually helps people to sort of see CSS as being a system and having a system for layout, which, we actually do these days. Because other languages, when we approach them with beginners, we begin with the important constructs of that language. I know a whole bunch of different back-end languages particularly. And you teach people how to learn those languages. You talk about functions, basic math, string handling, and so on. You explain all these underlying concepts. If you've got a beginner who isn't a programmer, you start with that stuff. You don't just sort of give them a bunch of stuff and say, oh, just kind of poke it around and see what works. And that's basically how we've been teaching CSS. So it's no wonder, I think, that people have become reliant on frameworks and so on to kind of do their job, because it all just seems really baffling and a little bit difficult to use. But I think that these days we can talk about CSS as a structure, in the same sort of structured way that we talk about other languages, and we can teach it in that structured way. And so this talk really is kind of a description of what I think is that structure, particularly for layout. And this is really sort of what I came to as I've been teaching this stuff in workshops. Now, I've not mentioned here the big specs. I've not kind of got grid and flexbox as main things, because I don't think we need to teach these as separate layout methods, because they're not. They're just values of display. And I think that by breaking things down into the individual modules, quite often, that's kind of exposing CSS working group process to web developers. And they don't really need to know these things are separate. They just need to know we've got this layout system, and this is how we use it. And so I think these are kind of the main things that we have to take people through when we're teaching them CSS. And it all begins with display. Because CSS has this system for layout. It's how we lay out web pages and web applications, and the main layout methods all belong to the display property. So if you want to do layout, you need to understand display. And you also need to understand where things start before we even get to messing about with the display property. Because CSS starts with normal flow, block and inline layout, and we need to understand this as the default state of things, the default state of layout. It's what happens, if it's what we return to, if we don't do anything else. So items in normal flow are participating in a block formatting context. Now, we often talk about this as there being no layout, but there is layout. There's block and inline layout. Each thing is a block thing or an inline thing. You write some HTML, you don't do anything, and it's readable. And that's a really neat thing about the web. Anyone can publish. It's why I started doing this. I've got no background in sort of computer science or whatever. I just wanted to get a website up because I had a baby and I wanted to show people pictures of the baby. And it was before there was Facebook and so on, so I had to build a website. And I was able to do that in really a few hours of learning because of this basic fact that you stick some HTML on a web page and it is readable by everyone. So it's important for us to understand normal flow in this way. It's a layout method. Right out of the gate, CSS starts doing some work for us by way of browser inbuilt style sheets, by the inbuilt style sheets and various user agents. And it's really important that we work with this and not against it. Because if we strip everything away with some kind of heavy-handed reset style sheet, which has been popular in the past, we basically then just have to go and put it all back again, rather than relying on what we've got. So let's not do that. So once we know that we've got layout, that our items are participating in a block formatting context, we better understand what it is to change the value of display. So I've got some items here, and they're displaying one after the other. They're block items. They're doing what block items do. And then I say display flex. So all I've done is I've changed the value of display on their container to flex. So the items now display alongside each other because they're becoming flex items. They no longer participate in a block formatting context, they are participating in a flex formatting context. And that means that the items start to behave like flex items, so we do the default flexbox things that items do. Or if I change the value to grid, the items now participate in a grid formatting context. Now, by default, that would give me a single column grid with implicit rows. It would look very much like a block formatting context, even though they are actually grid items. So if I use grid template columns here and create a 3-column track grid, then we get the items sort of laying out with auto placement on that grid. So whether we decide to use grid or flex, we only change the value of display on the parent. That changes the children's formatting context, but their children go right back to block and inline layout because we will always return to block and inline layout once we're inside the item. We're only kind of changing one level at a time. So if I add some more content to one of my grid items, I've got a heading and 2 paragraphs, that just goes back to block and inline layout. And so it goes all the way down through the structure of your document. You stay with the block formatting context, or you switch to another formatting context, and inside that you're going to go back to block and inline layout unless you decide to make a change again. One box all the way down. And once we're thinking like this, it becomes much easier to switch contexts. And this kind of strange thing that happens on the web where people decide that they can only build their site using grid or flexbox for some reason, like they're picking between 2 frameworks, that kind of goes away because we're not really worrying about that. We're just like, well, which formatting context suits these items the best? They're both values of display, use the one that works. But it's here with display that we see this refactoring of CSS that I sort of titled this talk with. It's really here where we see this writ large. The display specification now details 2 values for display, not 1. So these values describe the outer display and inner display type. So the outer display type is always block or inline. A box has got to be a block or an inline box. The inner display type is the one that the children use. So that might be flex items or grid items or something else in the future. So when I say display grid in sort of single value syntax, we're really saying display block grid. The outer box of the element is a block, so it's a block box in the layout, and the children are grid items. Their inner is grid. If we say display flex, we're really saying display block flex, a block container, flex children. So then we can use, in sort of the old single value syntax, we've got these values which are like inline-grid and inline-flex to represent an inline flex or grid container. So in the two-value world, we have display inline grid and display block grid. So we're able to actually directly say what we're doing. You know, we've got a block box and we've got flex children. We've got an inline box and we've got grid children. So this outer display type really explains how the box behaves in the layout. And so, you know, we only really have block or inline at the moment. Now, I don't think anyone's really going to be using these at the moment. That's because they're only actually implemented in Firefox right now. So it's not like you're going to suddenly start using these if you're using these things on the web, but I think it's interesting to describe them in this way. So when we talk about the outer display type, although you might be using display grid, for example, just thinking, yeah, that's display block grid, that's quite useful because you know how that box is behaving in the layout. And then if we go on to the inner display type, although if you say display grid, that you've still got one value, well, you know that that grid actually refers to the children, and it's how do the children behave next to each other. So this kind of is interesting in terms of just how we describe display, and there's nothing new added by the fact we've got these two values of display, because every one of them maps to a single value at the moment. Of course, it may be that something comes along in the future that only works with two values. But at the moment, you know, you can use either. So it's much more about just how we think about it and teach it. But if we go back to normal flow and think about these formatting contexts, which is how I kind of introduced how we're changing between layout methods. When we have a page on the web or in a book or what have you, anything that's formatted with CSS, it is establishing an initial block formatting context. A block formatting context, or BFC, has some features. Now, floats can't poke out of the bottom of it. Margins don't collapse through it. That's a BFC. And this is what happens if you don't have a block formatting context on a container. And this happens when you float something. If you float something inside a container and the floated item is taller than the text that's come up next to it, any sort of background that's on that entire box is going to sort of pop up because the float is taken out of the layout. And so you kind of end up with this situation where people say, well, I want that background to wrap around the image and the text, even if the text is shorter. And what's happening here is the line boxes are getting shortened and the thing's taken out of flow. So we've got this value in a single value world, display flow root, or block flow root if you're in a two value world. And that can basically cause the containing block to wrap the image and the text. So we basically end up with this, which is what we wanted in the first place. Now, web developers have been doing this for years by messing about with the value of overflow. Because if you change the value of overflow to something that could have scroll bars, you end up with a block formatting context. Because if something is like a scrollable area on a page, you've got to contain your floats and your margins because they can't be poking out of it. I mean, I don't even know what that would look like. So you end up, so web developers realized that one of these sort of CSS hacks was that they could change the value of overflow and it would contain everything in the box. With some kind of bad side effect, you occasionally get scroll bars appearing where you didn't expect them, and sometimes you end up clipping shadows and so on. So we've now got, in CSS, a proper way to do it, to say, I am creating a new block formatting context, everything please stay inside here, and that's display flow root or display block flow root. And then we have writing modes. And I don't think that you can talk about layout without talking about writing modes. Because when Flexbox and Grid landed in our browsers, they also, just very quietly, introduced a writing mode agnostic way of working with layout. Everything that comes before kind of relates to physical dimensions. We talk about top, right, bottom, and left, horizontal and vertical, X and Y. And suddenly we asked everyone to think about start and end and block and inline. And that was kind of quite unusual to a lot of people. They're like, well, why are we doing that? Why aren't we just saying left and right and top and bottom like we always have done? And so these concepts are critical to understanding of layout today. And so I think that really early on in the process, when I'm wanting to teach people about this stuff, I want to talk about writing modes. So the block dimension, that's the direction in which blocks are displayed on the page. So in English, that's a language written horizontally. Blocks are displayed vertically, one below the other down the page. And the inline direction is always the direction in which words run in a sentence. In English, that's obviously left to right horizontally. These things relate to our understanding of block and inline layout. Inline boxes line up next to each other like words in a sentence. Block elements take up all the space in the inline dimension and then stack up one after the other. And if we use a vertical writing mode, now the block dimension is running horizontally and the inline vertically. So if we need to think about start in the block dimension, or maybe like line 1 in grid, then this is the line at which our blocks will start. So in English, that's the top of the element. In a vertical RL language, that's on the right. So block start, and then where the blocks end, that's block end. And so if you need to think about start in the inline direction, or again, line 1 in grid, then that's where a sentence starts in that writing mode and direction. So on the left for English, on the right for Arabic, it might be at the top for a vertical writing mode. So that's inline start. And the other end, sort of where your sentences would wrap, that is inline end. So that's fine. That kind of works for flexbox and grid. We know about this. But the problem is we've then got this tension between our new layout methods, which talk about start and end and block and inline and never mention the physical dimensions, and then everything else, margins, padding, border, positioning, floats, everything else is tied to physical dimensions. That's how we've described this, for years and years and years. And if you try and build something using a vertical writing mode, you soon spot this. For instance, we might want to build a grid layout, and we should be able to do that, and we should just be able to turn it on its side, change it to a vertical writing mode, and everything should stay the same. But it doesn't, because this box has got a width and a height. And so width and height is the same, even if you're in a vertical writing mode. Width still refers to width. It doesn't change. And so we end up with our box sort of looking a bit weird, because the grid has stayed the same, but the actual container hasn't changed because it's tied to these physical properties. So we've got this entire new specification, logical properties and values. And all it really is a series of mappings. It says, this is what this is in the physical world, and this is what it is in a logical flow relative world. And the easiest way to look at that is with that example of the grid. So here with my grid, rather than using width, I'm using inline size, and rather than using height, I'm using block size, which means that when I tip my grid on the side using a different writing mode, the dimensions all stay the same, because inline stays the same measure and so on, so it just sort of tips over. So because we're already talking about block and inline dimensions, these names hopefully kind of make sense. The block size property defines the size in the block dimension, and the inline size describes the size in the inline dimension. So here we are in a horizontal writing mode, and here we are in a vertical writing mode. So we're just mapping it to different things depending on which writing mode we're in. So we have these mappings for everything, for margin and padding and borders. You can see all of these are just essentially just a direct mapping one to the other, referring to block and inline rather than sort of top, right, bottom, and left. We even have ones for border radius, which I think are my favorite property names now in CSS, because we have things like border start radius and border start end radius, which I think are wonderful. And I kind of like to show those to people, but it does work. You don't often have to specify these things individually, but I think that's quite neat. But in terms of teaching CSS, we actually use a lot of these things now in the browser. There's very good support for all the mapped properties in the main browsers, which is great. We're starting to be able to use these things on the web. But it'll be a while before I think generally everyone starts to use these. I think probably on the web it'll become the default way of actually describing layout for a lot of people eventually. But obviously, until kind of the browsers have caught up or the older browsers have vanished, people are going to be using the physical ones, I think, for a while yet. But I think it's really important to think in terms of this flow relative logical world. Our new layout methods make a huge amount more sense when you're thinking in this way rather than being tied to the physical dimensions. Once you start to think about start and end and block and inline, everything else makes an awful lot more sense. And somewhere where it does start to make a lot of sense, and I think it makes the specs easier to understand, is when we come to alignment. Box alignment is a key specification which kind of ties together a lot of these other specifications. If you learned flexbox first, if that was kind of your first introduction to the new layout methods, so if you learned flexbox a few years ago, the alignment properties, you probably thought of them as being flexbox properties because they actually started life in the flexbox spec. You sort of look at these, it happens a lot in CSS, you know, we look at something and go, actually that's quite generally useful. It doesn't want to be tied just to flexbox. Let's take that out, put it in its own spec, and then we can use it, you know, for different layout methods, which is what's happened. So box alignment deals with alignment right across CSS. That's flexbox grid, but also block layout, multicol, although the actual browser implementations for things like block layout aren't really there yet. So this talks about aligning things in the block and inline dimension. And I think the reason we need to talk about writing modes before we talk about this is because once we start aligning things, we're talking all the time about block and inline. And we're talking about two things in alignment. We're talking about the distribution of space, so extra space that you've got once you've got some things and there's some extra space around them, and also an alignment of items inside the space that they've been put in, so kind of moving something around inside its kind of area. Now, generally, I think it's easier to understand alignment in grid layout, because in grid layout, we've got this very nice, tidy grid. We always have the two dimensions, and they don't change in the way that they do with Flexbox. So I tend to introduce this stuff with grid first. So the first thing we're going to look at is the distribution of space around elements. So we've got some extra space here in this grid container. So I've got a grid container here. I've got some items. They don't completely fill the grid. So there's some extra space. By default with grid, things are lined up to start in both dimensions. So our extra space is at the end on both dimensions there. So we can say justify content, and that will space things out in the inline dimension. So we use justify in the inline dimension a bit like if you justify words in a sentence, and that happens on the inline dimension. When we're using the justify words, that's because we're talking about that dimension there. So here I'm saying justify content, space between, and the space gets picked up and shared out between the tracks. That's going to sort of blow apart the items there. And the lines you can see on this grid here are using the Firefox Grid Inspector. If you are working with grid and things and sort of experimenting with stuff, use Firefox. The Grid Inspector is fantastic. It will show you a nice highlighted view of your grid, and you'll be able to see what's going on. Then we've got align content, which works in the same way, but on the block dimension. So here I've said align content end, and so the items have all moved down, and we've got the spare space put before them. Now, when you talk about Flexbox, we justify on the main axis and we align on the cross axis, because in Flexbox you can change your main axis. You can lay your things out as a row or as a column. So we worry about the main axis as opposed to block and inline. So we justify on the main axis, align on the cross axis. So justify content, we've got main axis, a space distribution between the flex items. So here we've got justify content, flex end, and the items have all gone to the end, and the spare space is put before them. If you've got space on the cross axis in Flexbox, with Flexbox you can wrap your flex items, and then if you've got a sort of taller container for those items and they're wrapping, you can use align content then to space them out. Now, people often don't realize that align content works in Flexbox because you typically don't have extra space in the cross-axis for Flexbox. And for content properties to do anything, you have to have some spare space to distribute. No spare space, there's nothing to share out, nothing's going to happen. I get an awful lot of emails about broken alignment, which turns out they've just not got any spare space, so nothing's going to happen in that case. So we then have this kind of moving of items around inside an area. Again, easier to understand in grid. By default, we stretch items in grid, so the item kind of totally fills up its area. This is what we can see here, and it's why you get like full height columns by default in grid layout and in Flexbox. You know, we're stretching the item so it fills the area, but you can play around with that. So if we use justify self and align self end, the item just gets bumped down into the corner of its area. So we're going to the end of its area in both dimensions. And you can set them all at once, by using justify items, which essentially just sets them all as a group. So if we're justifying in flexbox, and that should say justify items, I think. No, that's right, it should say justify items. That slide's wrong. We should display, it doesn't apply to flex items because there's more than one item on the main axis. But you can do alignment on the cross axis because you can say align self center and you can move things around. Again, you've got to have a tall enough flex container, either because your content is taller or because you've given it a height. And then you can move the items up and down against each other. If you do need self-alignment of items on the main axis, then what we've got in the spec is a mention of using auto margins. Now, auto margins are really interesting in layout. We use them all the time on the web. If you've got a box, if you've got a box that you want to center, and what you do is you basically set its left and right margin to auto, and that pushes the box into the middle. And the reason it does that is that auto margins take up all of their space in the dimension they're applied to. So if you've got an auto margin on both sides, well, they're both trying to take up all the space. It pushes your box into the middle. Auto margins are really useful in Flex and in Grid as well, but particularly in Flexbox. If you want to do this sort of thing, because you can't self-align an item on the main axis, you're sort of stuck. And if you sort of, in that pattern, and you think, well, I want just to separate these items, which is actually a very common navigation pattern to have, like, I don't know, search or something on one side and then everything else lined up the other way. If you set an auto margin on the item that you want, or the items that you want to kind of be pushed aside, that will cause that to happen. Basically, the auto margin takes up all of the available space and separates the items. Now, it's this sort of thing that I think that we have typically referred to as some kind of CSS hack or trick. And it's not. It's in the spec. It is specified that this is how auto margins work. And I think that's really important. You know, I really would like people to stop calling stuff that is in a CSS spec a hack, because it just leads to this idea that CSS is this flaky, fragile, weird language that, you know, you have to know all these special magic hacks in order to use. So it's in the spec. This is as specified. And so, yeah, when I see people referring to things like that, I get very grumpy. I review a lot of articles for Smashing Magazine and leave comments all over people's stuff. I'm like, is this a hack, or is this just actually what the specification says? Because if it's what the specification says, then say, as in the specification, and point to it so that people can learn why it is that this works and why we're doing it. So yes, that's the hill I am going to die on. But what about the box model? You know, at no point, that was kind of the mainstay. I have drawn box model diagrams so many times over my career. I've taught the box model in so many different ways. And I think that these days it is less important for people to have that kind of understanding. It's certainly not the first thing I need to teach people. It mattered a lot in the past because we had to do layout. We had to give everything a percentage size and make sure those percentages did not add up to more than 100%, because when they did, bad things happened to the layout. You know, we don't have to do that anymore. We can allow Flexbox and Grid to figure out sizing for us, which means that the box model, I think, gets demoted as not quite as an important thing to have to worry too much about. And we've also got better ways of dealing with the box model, in fact, that we can change what that actually means in terms of sizing. So this is really what I think we need to be telling people about the box model with added dev tools, which I think help to highlight this stuff. So we've got everything in CSS obviously has a box. The block level box is a very specific thing. It's got some default behavior. It expands to fill the inline direction, and it grows in the block direction only to the size of the content. But we can give it a width or a height. And when we do, CSS has to decide what we mean. So it does that while taking into account the various things that make up the box. So the box has got the content. Now we call that the content box. And here I've set my size, and I've just got my content there. You might then give it some padding. If you do, that's added around the edges of the content. The edge of the padding is referred to as the padding box. The box might have a visible border. If you do, then the size of this border is added onto the outside of the padding. That is the border box. And then it might have a margin, and this is then added to the outside of the border, pushing away things that are outside the box, and that is the margin box. So, what's the inline size or the width of the box? Now, by default, for reasons that we will not go into. That is the content box. So that means that the size of your content is actually the size, not the sort of physical, the space it actually takes up on the screen or the page, which, has always been slightly confusing to people. And that's why now we can change it. So you can set box sizing to border box, and that says, hey, right, that size is now what you can see, so including the padding and the border. That's the size you've given it. So essentially, the content box gets smaller when you do it that way around. But it means that you can choose that and use CSS to switch between the different ways of doing sizing. I don't think we need to burden beginners to this with our history. We can just say, this is what it is. If you find it more useful to have the content size, the thing you want the size, well, then use the default. Otherwise, use box sizing, border box, and it will include the padding and the border. And then I think there's much more useful things that we can be talking about with sizing. So in the past, everything, as I say, was a length or a percentage. So we spent a lot of time calculating how big things were, but it was pretty easy to do because we all understand, like 100 and different percentages of that. That was okay, when we got quite good at doing it. In our new layout world, however, we have to wonder what the browser's doing, because the browser's doing a lot of this for us. And it's doing this by looking at what the minimum size of the thing is and what the maximum size of the thing is. So we have to understand that. If we want to understand what is going on when sizing is happening, we need to know what the minimum size of the thing and the maximum size of the thing is. And luckily, we've actually got some keywords that describe this, so we can even play around with it and have a look. And they work. At the moment, they work in grid layout in all the browsers that support grid, so that's a good place to play with them. So if I say I've got a 2-column grid here, and I'm using grid template columns, I'm creating a column track at min content, and I'm creating a column track at max content. The min content track, the content wraps. It takes any soft wrapping opportunity it can. It gets as small as it possibly can. That is the min content size. It's not overflowing. If you put something in there that had a fixed size, that would become the size of it. So it all scrunches down. It becomes as small as it can, min content size. The max content size, if you've got a string of text, it all unravels. It gets as long as it can. That's its max content size. It won't get any bigger. It'll just get as big as it needs to be for the whole thing to kind of unravel. Any content-based sizing that the browser is doing, or anything that's implementing flexbox and grid, it's doing this based on these min and max content sizes. So that's how it works. And so understanding what they are is a good start at understanding what's going on. So if we look at flexbox, I've got 3 items here of different sizes. If we use the flex initial values, they don't grow to fill the space. And there's enough room for them, so they lay out at max content size. They don't get bigger than max content size. They just go to max content size, and then they stop growing. Now, if I give them flex auto, it's like saying you can grow and shrink from a size of auto, which means that they can grow. And so they grow and they fill the container. It kind of looks like we've got 3 equally sized flex items. But that's only because we've got pretty much the same size content in each box. Not quite. The items aren't actually quite the same size if you measured them, because some of those words are slightly longer. But if we add more content, you can see that the item with a lot of space a lot of words gets assigned more space. The smaller things actually shrink down to their min content size to let the thing that's got all of the content take up more space and be more readable. Now, if you don't want that kind of behavior, you can change it. If you do want 3 equal size items, rather than letting the browser sort of figure this all out, you can set your flex basis to 0. Flex 1 will do that. And essentially what you're saying there is these items have got no intrinsic size. Just share out all the size space in the container equally between them. But I think actually understanding the fact that we've got min content size and max content size, and that by default, Flexbox and Grid will be using that to sort of figure out how much space to assign things, which is, in the terms of Flexbox, is brilliant. You can kind of chuck a bunch of unevenly sized items at it, and it doesn't squash, a big thing into a tiny box and leave loads of space around a small thing. I mean, as in terms of like working with web content where you never know what you're going to get, it's been sort of groundbreaking to be able to do that sort of thing. But understanding these min and max content sizes, I think, is incredibly important for anyone starting to do layout, because it's how these things are being calculated now. Now, as I say, I work a lot on the web, and when I'm sort of talking about this stuff, there will be people who will be sat in the audience and going, ah, yes, some of these things you have spoken about, they are not implemented in browsers, and therefore it is useless for us to learn them. And I think that when I'm talking about some of this stuff, particularly things like the two values of display and so on, it's not so much that, oh, we should be going out and using this stuff right now. It may not be implemented in the things that the user agents that we're targeting. But I think it shows how CSS is moving on and what the progression is and the sort of things that are becoming important in the language so that we can teach it, you know, as it is designed, rather than teaching it based on a bunch of quirks and hacks that we have to do in order to support it in whatever we're using CSS with. Because we do have a system. Certainly in browser land, you know, a lot of this stuff is not so much that we have this sort of real buggy behavior. It's more that some things are implemented, some things are not implemented yet. And that's never going to change. You know, there's never going to be a point at which the CSS working group can sit down and say, right, resolved, and it'll just magically appear in all the browsers. That would be marvelous. That's not going to happen. There's always going to be a lag. And obviously, because of the way that CSS tends to be developed, it is often developed because one browser wants to do something and they've started to, you know, put some of the groundwork in place. So obviously, they're kind of going to be first out of the gate with the implementation because they're already thinking about it, or maybe they need it for something. You know, I mean, we got grid layout really because you know, Microsoft started doing the work because they needed it for something they were doing internally. So you know, it's always going to be a bit of a lag in terms of waiting for these things to happen. So we obviously have specifications, and that's really what we should be explaining, because then we can explain the browser support part or the user agent support part, saying, you know, these things haven't yet implemented this stuff. And typically, you know, lack of support is very different to buggy support. And that, you know, that's sort of, so as a web developer, I come from a time when, you know, there were certain things that you used to be able to do in IE6 that would just make half of your content vanish. You know, that doesn't really happen anymore. So things are getting better. You know, obviously software has bugs, and sometimes things happen. You know, browsers implement something and the spec changes, and so you know we end up with sort of slightly weird situations. Less so these days, but that's happening, and I think that it's actually a lot easier to explain to people that yes, you know, there are bugs, and this is a bug, and when it's fixed, this won't happen anymore. But you know, rather than sort of just treating it like it's just all weird and it's just a bunch of hacks anyway. Obviously, these days, we've got things like feature queries, so we can actually ask the browser, you know, what it supports and fork our code accordingly. You know, I think that all of this kind of conditional stuff is very, very interesting to me. We've got new media queries, media features that let us say, you know, is this person using a coarse pointer, therefore they're using a touch screen. They're using their finger on a touch screen rather than a mouse. Much better ways of detecting how people are interacting with stuff. I think that is all very exciting and lets us start to shape the experiences that we're putting in front of people based on actually what they've got, you know, what they're able to use. Are they using a touchscreen? Are they using a mouse? Do they prefer dark mode on their device? You know, do they want, you know, fewer animations because they've asked for reduced animations? You know, we can start to ask all of this stuff directly from within CSS and fork what we're doing accordingly to give them the best kind of experience when they're using these applications. I think that's very exciting to me, and not just kind of worrying about, well, how big is their screen? So I think really, you know, to kind of wrap up, I think as I've mentioned a few times, we need to stop talking about CSS as a weird and quirky thing. There's been so much work put into kind of sorting this stuff out and to refactoring it and making sure that CSS is something that we can teach, that, you know, I can do a workshop and actually teach it in a structured way so people can leave at the end of the day actually with a real kind of laying out how they're going to actually go forward and learn the different bits they need to fill in. we've changed the language, it created this kind of cohesive and sensible layout system. It is a language that's like no other because it serves multiple environments that aren't like anything else. The things that we're doing with CSS. We're doing the CSS for print workshop yesterday, which has a whole load of different constraints and so on than the world that I spend probably 80% of my time in, which is on the web. We've got very different constraints. And so CSS is this fantastic language that can do, a book and a magazine or a website or a very complex application. We've been doing an awful lot of amazing stuff with a language that kind of started as a way to format some text documents. And the fact that even, all those websites, that I built, years and years ago when I first started using CSS, they still work. We've managed to refactor CSS and to move it into the place where it is now, without ever breaking the web, without breaking all of those websites that are kind of out there and still exist. They're still working in browsers. I think that is a very, very neat thing about CSS. But I think that we can teach it now in a robust and structured manner. I think we can give people the skills to use the CSS of today and the CSS of tomorrow, and also how to learn to cope with the browsers and user agents of the past where necessary. I think if we're teaching CSS, whether that's within Teams or answering questions on Twitter or writing books, speaking at conferences, whatever, I really, really want people to sort of change how they talk about the language. I think we want to teach the CSS of today. We want to teach how it is now, not burdening beginners with our history and keeping the scars of the browser wars for kind of our own reminiscing in the pub and keep moving forward, refactoring the way that we talk about CSS. Thank you very much. And I think I can take questions. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. We have a few minutes for questions.
Is this working? Yes, it is. Sorry, that was quite a lot of build-up for this question. I feel awkward. That was great, thank you. It was really interesting. How do you think we get people to stop talking about things as hacks? Because it seems to me that that's almost clickbait language, and clickbait language drives clicks. So how do you think, what language can we give people to replace that is equally exciting and equally likely to get them to click on something?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because obviously I edit a large magazine website, so I think about titles quite a lot. Actually, our best performing titles tend to be much more like, understand this or how to do X. I actually find that people, I think in general, yes, if you have a very kind of sort of clickbaity headline, people might click through to it, but they often then bounce straight back out again when it realizes it's not really going to solve what they want. So we actually find that our best performing stuff, and it's quite interesting, are just those very sort of solid, how to solve this problem. And you can do that with, you don't have to talk about it like it's some sort of weird quirk that you've discovered. I think that's part of it. People are like, oh, look at me, I'm very clever, I've discovered this strange thing about CSS. And it's like, well, maybe you have, but maybe it's just in the spec, or, very often people come to me with something groundbreaking they think they've discovered, and I'm just like, that's just what it says in the specification, but nobody reads the things. So, but yeah, I think that's it. I think it is just giving people what is most useful to them, which actually is solving problems usually.
Okay, any other question? Oh, yes, over there.
Thank you again for the talk. I've never actually used CSS, so as a total beginner, how would you suggest I start using it?
I would, as a complete beginner, I think probably the best place to go at the moment is to go to MDN's Learn section on CSS, and I say that because I rewrote a good chunk of it recently, so I know it's fairly up to date. But I mean, MDN anyway. I mean, if you need to look up stuff about CSS, I sort of see MDN as being the sort of notes on the spec. They're kind of like the user guide for the specifications, you know. So they tend to be very accurate, have lots of good examples of how you'd use a property and so on. But they've also got a whole learn section for people who are either new to CSS or haven't done CSS for a few years, because I think, you know, things have changed to an extent that if you used CSS 10 years ago and haven't used it since really and want to pick it up again, you're probably better just to go there and see how things have changed and what the important stuff is.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have time for one question. No other question. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you again.